There's one person I can tell you absolutely doesn't think that anything negative is possible, and that's President Trump's golfing buddy, Lindsey Graham, who doubled down himself over the weekend and literally called out the president and threw down the Obama card. Watch this.
I think it's a defining moment in his presidency. Ronald Reagan went to the Berlin Wall and he said, tear down this wall. He didn't say, could you make it lower? When asked about what the protesters should do, President Trump said, keep protesting, help is on the way. If this regime is still standing, the day after, if we pull the plug, will be 100 years of chaos. I have every confidence that President Trump will do what he promised to the people. Help is on the way, keep protesting. If this regime falls, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, they all go. It'd be the biggest change since the fall of the Berlin Wall. But here's one thing I know. Donald Trump is Ronald Reagan plus in my mind. Venezuela, soon Cuba. The one thing you can't do as president, talk like Reagan and act like Obama.
Wow, you know that President Trump hates the word Obama or anything associated with it. Do you think that this is going to sway President Trump?
Well, let's be frank. Mr. Netanyahu detested Obama simply because Obama would not go the distance that he demanded. Obama capitulated on some issues, but ultimately Obama's heart was not in this business, and he was a little stronger at that point than I think President Trump is right now, because Obama did not depend as heavily on the donors that are there now as President Trump does. So I don't think, I think Lindsey Graham is essentially telling the world we have to execute something analogous to the Mongolian invasion of Persia and the Middle East, or we're finished. We've lost, and Trump is finished. I don't agree with that, and I don't like the idea of doing to Persia or the Middle East what the Mongols did, because that's effectively what's planned right now from the Air Force and the Navy.
And, you know, one other thing, Doug, which I think is important to point out here, all these things that whether it's Kudlow, Keene, or with Tom Cotton, any number of a bunch of other senators, Senator Britt, and certainly Lindsey Graham here, these folks are all lobbying hard. And I have not heard anything about any American national security interest, any American economic interest, or any defense of anything in America. They have not said a word about that. And if all this sounds familiar, it probably should. Here from about a year and a half ago is former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett lobbying for the same thing.
What we need to ensure is that this octopus of terror, whose head is in Tehran and its arms are all around the region and the world, by the way, they want to assassinate Americans in America, Iran. So by ultimately strangling that head of the octopus, cutting the head off, the whole octopus of terror goes away, and America is safe, Israel is safe, the world is safe.
So, I mean, this has been going on and been blasting to Americans for a long time. But, Doug, I mean, we got to just call it what it is. This is 100%, not 95, 100% in the interest of one nation, and it's Israel, and it's not ours. Why then do we have literally that? Gary, put that graphic up again of all the combat power we have in that region. Why is all of the American combat power, air and sea, basically handed over to the prime minister of another country?
Well, you know, the why has a lot to do with money and power that flows from enormous wealth. And enormous wealth was invested to put President Trump into the White House. And President Trump is not going to turn a deaf ear to the people that put him there. We just have to understand that. I think it's deplorable. I don't support it. And by the way, I would go one step further. I'm not anxious to see Israel destroyed. I never have been. I've been worried since the sort of revenge campaign after 7 October that Israel would put itself in an impossible position in the region where it couldn't possibly exist in the future because of all the bad blood that's being shed all over the countryside. I'm really worried about that. Obviously, the Israeli government isn't. They think that if they can destroy everything around them and anyone that is not willing to subordinate themselves to Israeli national interest, that's a good thing. But that's not necessarily attainable. We could go on, but I'm really concerned right now because I look at the White House and I get the impression that it's like a nuclear power station that's already in meltdown. It's got enormous problems in the financial markets. The economy is not sound, contrary to popular belief. We are in a very fragile position, and the American public wants action, but not necessarily what we're doing in the Middle East. It could rebound to our disadvantage in a dramatic way. And when I say it's like a nuclear power station, I think everybody is running around trying to manage all the things that are wrong. You heard President Trump earlier in that particular discussion say, well, we have a lot of things going. And he mentions Ukraine and what's happening there and what's happening in the Middle East, and talked about Venezuela briefly. But he didn't talk about what's happening inside the United States. What's happening in the United States is very important, much more important than anything we're doing overseas. And what I see happening in a place like Minnesota, which admittedly could have been handled better, is a retreat from the enforcement of federal law, which is vital and essential if we are going to survive as a nation, let alone as a great power. So that's why I'm saying that, a lot of people are focused on different things, and we're setting everything aside, just as we started by talking about the START Treaty, setting that aside, which I consider to be very dangerous and ill-advised, all in favor of making Israel first a reality. So you're correct. We are going to war for reasons that have nothing to do with what is important to us and everything to do with the interests of Israel and and the diaspora and its agents in the United States.
Yeah, and Doug, I'm right with you on, and I have been since 10/7 all the way through that the Israeli policies of Netanyahu have been undermining the security and the long-term stability of Israel itself. And I have been so adamant against it, not negative or against Israel, but for Israel, because they're going down a path that I think is going to eventually be self-destructive, and we could be on that path right now. Pretty much, and you've laid this out really well here. We have to just hope against hope that this meltdown won't happen. And we'll just roll the dice and hope that putting a little bit of water on the cooler is going to work. Because if Iran isn't as weak as what Keane and all these other folks say, and if they have the ability to sustain through that 10 or 12 day period and continue to be viable and continue to throw missiles, and then all of a sudden we don't have enough to go with it, everything could start to crumble. And it's so ironic because you have probably one of the biggest ones in America, the pro-Israeli guy is Mark Levin on Fox News. And it's so perverse that in advocating that Trump do what he wants, he could literally be making things worse for his own country. Watch this.
Those people are suffering from a complete lack of civil liberties, a destitute economy, and a nearly non-existent middle class. It used to have a very vibrant middle class. Not anymore. The regime controls all aspects of the culture, communication, even whether the lights are turned off or on throughout the country, just like North Korea. And it is turning into a countrywide concentration camp, just like North Korea. Now, if we don't act, and by that I mean not diplomacy, but decisively, quickly and overwhelmingly with our military against the top of the regime, Khomeini and his cohorts in that circle, Iran will in fact build nuclear weapons, as North Korea has, despite dozens of agreements over the decades with Republican and Democrat presidents.
So again, he is literally pleading against any diplomacy, and we have to use our military to go after them. And he's just got to hope that they don't have the ability to shoot back in ways that's going to harm Israel itself.
Well, I'm sure everyone in Iran is deeply moved by his expression of concern for the Iranian people.
Oh, I'm sure they are.
Look, his agenda is obvious. It's not American, it's Israeli. That's fine. But I can't sign up for that particular agenda because, as I said earlier, I think it will backfire badly on us. It'll have a terrible impact on the region, and I think it'll ultimately backfire on Israel. But it doesn't matter what we think. We're not in power. We're not in authority. We don't have $1 billion at our disposal. We can't buy politicians right now. We can't buy any access to the presidency. And if you don't have billions of dollars, you can't do that in the American system that the billionaires have created. You're irrelevant, and they're very happy about that. I mean, President Trump actually made a joke recently where somebody was comparing his hair to Justin Bieber, and he responded, well, the difference between a wet raccoon and my hair is that I have $3 billion in the bank. Well, I think he's telling you what he values, telling you what's important. And you and I and what we think are not important. And I think millions of Americans are watching that and listening to that. And they're asking, my God, what did I do when I voted for this man?
Yeah, and right now it's a kind of a rhetorical question like that, but in the event that we start suffering lots of casualties in a war we chose and it's not going well and Iran is not playing its script and losing like it's supposed to be, those questions will get a little bit harder to contemplate. But right now, that's all theoretical. As you say, no one knows for sure what Iran can do or what it will do, and we all have to wait and find out. But I suspect that diplomacy is not going to succeed, and we're going to find out one way or the other here pretty soon. What do you think?
Well, I think so. One last point before we go. I think we need to understand something. This is not the end of the process. If Iran is successfully destroyed and disintegrates, the next step on this ladder will be Turkey. And I think anybody who believes otherwise in the region is foolish. I think the Turks are aware of that. So this is not the end. This is just the near-term goal. The question is, what do the American people do? Let's face it, the Americans have slept through most of these conflicts and crises over 30, 40 years. That's one of our problems, that what happens beyond our borders has not mattered a great deal to us because we're very focused on what happens here. And that's, in my judgment, that's appropriate. I agree with that. But this will be different, and this will change everything for us globally, not just regionally in the Middle East.
Well, we're certainly going to watch and how that goes on. Before I let you go, though, I want to get your views on something else that's happening. You mentioned a little bit about the START Treaty, about what's going on in Europe. There's some bigger issues, well, maybe not bigger, additional issues that also impact American national security, and that is on the transatlantic relationship and where a lot of that is going. You have been a long-time advocate that NATO should have gone the way of the dodo bird a long time ago because it outlived its usefulness, et cetera. That seems to maybe be belatedly occurring to some in Europe now, especially with President Trump's move potentially on Greenland and all the angst that caused. And at the Oslo Security Conference yesterday, or maybe it was even this morning, the Radmila Shekerinska, sorry if I'm butchering her name, I feel bad for that, the Deputy NATO Secretary General is acknowledging that there has been a big shift and is acknowledging that maybe Europe needs to pay more attention to its own security.
It is true that the time when we could, some would say conveniently, give up on focusing on security and allow the US to deal with it is over. And this is a much more just and more stable arrangement in which not only US but also Canada and European allies can trust. And I have to say that trust goes both ways. Yeah. But it is true that for many years, actually decades, as Europeans, we got used to US carrying most of the burden in an unacceptable way, maybe acceptable after the Second World War, but practically this has been the source of frustration for so many years and for so many administrations. We also have to be open about this fact. And there is a clear sense, and I would say even understanding and consensus among all allies, that we will continue to develop, you called it previously European pillar of NATO, European defense within NATO, and this balance sharing, actually balance shifting, will strengthen the alliance.
So do you think that Europe is finally belatedly recognizing balance, burden shifting, that they're going to have to pick up more? Do you think that's going to happen?
Well, there's nothing original in her remarks. In a speech in Munich in 2017, Chancellor Merkel made the statement that it was clear based upon her observations and interactions with the Trump administration that Europe could no longer depend upon the United States, that Europe would have to find its own way, that it was simply a fact of life. And then subsequently, we had President Macron of France, who made the famous statement that NATO was brain dead, that NATO needed to rethink everything it was doing. Look, NATO has been a zombie organization for some time. The crisis, war in Ukraine has destroyed NATO. That's something that I believed was going to happen in January of 2022, and I said it. The Russians haven't had to drop a single bomb or fire a single round in the direction of NATO. NATO has destroyed itself. It's destroyed itself because it aligned itself with the wrong people for the wrong reasons in Ukraine. It involved itself in something for which it was never designed. It tried to wage an offensive war using primarily American and selected equipment from other European states with the NATO command structure. It's failed miserably. They weren't prepared for a very new and different kind of war, and the Russians discovered how they could effectively counter anything that the NATO alliance could come up with. And right now, just a little east of and south of Zaporizhzhia, you have a giant battle of encirclement commencing that will probably finish off what remains of the Ukrainian combat power that's still on the ground that could do anything. So I don't think she's telling anybody anything that we haven't already figured out. The question now is, what does the future look like? And I don't think NATO in its current form has a future. You're going to see new kinds of security arrangements that are more regionalized, that conform to the interests of the people that live there. Because the people that live in Oslo or Berlin or Warsaw do not see the same threat picture as the people that live in Rome or Madrid or in Athens. It's a simple fact. And Turkey, of course, is a NATO member, largely in name only, and has been for some time. It has very different interests. It sees itself rightly as a great power in the region with its own interests. So I'm not sure this woman's statement is very meaningful, Dan. It should get a big yawn from everybody. Thanks very much. We figured that out already. And the question is, what's the future look like? It does not look like the current NATO alliance.
You know, and that was also not the idea that they're going to put some feet behind that and to do something about it for their own national security was belied a little bit with Secretary General Mark Rutte, who earlier today was in Kiev, and in that situation there, he was talking about. You know what? He was acting like that there had not been the last 4 years of war. I won't show you the soundbite right now, but basically he is saying, yeah, we're still with you. The NATO is still going to be there, and you can count on us, and we're going to be there for you. And you know, and I'm like, you got to be kidding me. The juxtaposition between this couldn't be more clear. That there's almost no power in the capital city other than the generators for this shot here, and you're talking like everything's going to be good. And if that's the NATO the mentality, then where is how is that going to scare Russia, for example? If NATO is so detached from reality, Doug, how is Russia going to be afraid that NATO is one day going to be an existential threat?
Well, the short answer is no one's afraid. How afraid were the Soviets or Nazis in 1939 of the British Empire and the French? Remember, the Poles flew from Warsaw to London in search of a guarantee for their security. And the British, unfortunately, under the influence of people like Churchill, said, oh, yes, of course, we'll give you a guarantee. And we'll stand with you. You know, we'll be with the Poles. And what happened? Well, the Germans and the Soviets intervened, carved up Poland, and not a single solitary British Royal Air Force fighter took off to fight anybody. The British Navy did nothing. They declared war, but ultimately it didn't make any difference to the Poles. And I think that's exactly what's been happening ultimately in Eastern Europe with Ukraine. And if the Eastern Europeans are smart, they will throw this nonsense under the bus and start looking at arrangements that provide them with security, because asking us to show up in a moment's notice to travel 7,000 miles in a heartbeat to save them from anybody is absurd. And I think President Trump has tried to tell them that as politely as he could, certainly during his first term. and probably a little less politely during a second. NATO is a dead end, and I don't care what Rutte says. Rutte is sitting there with the fools in London in 1939 and doesn't seem to understand that great powers are not going to pay any attention to that. Right now, the great power in Eurasia and Europe is Russia.